Welcome and thank you for joining the NEHA National Webinar Series. This is the fourth and final installment of our leadership series, The Hard Facts of Soft Skills. I'm Christy Denbrock, Chief Learning Officer at NEHA. Today, our presenter is Kathy Walker. Kathy is the Regional News Director for iHeart Media in the Rocky Mountain region. Kathy has over 30 years of news experience and running in an award-winning newsroom with multiple Edward R. Murrow Awards. Kathy continued on air for a record of 10 hours straight during the Columbine school shooting and winning an additional Edward R. Murrow Award. She will discuss ways to build and maintain working media relationships before, during, and after a crisis. During her presentation, please feel free to write any questions you may have into the chat box, and we will address them at the end of her presentation. If you are not a NEHA member and you enjoy this session, we invite you to become one at neha.org. Kathy, we go back many, many years, and you have some great examples to share with us of building and working with the media before a crisis happens and how to get environmental and public health information out to all your listeners, viewers. So why don't you just jump in and let us know the best way to move forward?
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure for me to talk about media and media relationships. I think they're valuable and important. And even if you have a very small amount of time to spend on them, they might pay great rewards. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment, but first I really want to talk about why you should meet the media before your worst day. Part of it is because it's your worst day, all right? In my view, all media interactions really go a lot better if you practice and rehearse them. No one wants to have their first on-camera interview, their first radio interview, their first answering of a reporter's question on your worst day in the middle of a crisis. So on a day when you're responding to that crisis, don't make that your day you're doing your first media interview ever, or even your first attempt at trying to organize media people. That's a challenge in and of itself. Everybody wants you, but nobody wants you at the same time. Nobody wants you in the same place. That can be really challenging. In the media, we have no idea, absolutely none, what you are, who you are, or what your total responsibilities are. We are very ignorant about all of that. We do understand that you're supposed to respond to the media, but we may not have any idea what the rest or breadth of your responsibilities might be. So we might misunderstand and misinterpret things, which is why sometimes, even though we're going very quickly, we need you to just be calm and talk about things in a way in which present great understanding and that there's no misunderstanding. On a day when you are in crisis, it's likely that you and the people around you will not have time to answer follow-up and clarifying questions, and so that's why it's super important to be very well understood. So let me share my screen and we'll kind of get into it. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so I work in Denver. Obviously, that's a big part of my world. I'm going to try and make this happen now in the right way. I think we're doing it right. And I am a big believer in thinking about having media contacts, in producing a media list so you have an idea of who you want to reach out to.
Kathy, I'm not seeing your PowerPoint.
Ah, well then let me try that again. Sure. Thanks, Christy. I appreciate that.
Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no, I appreciate it.
That there we are. We have success.
There we go. All right. So there's my little table of contents. You need to have contacts. You need to have media lists. When is it okay to play favorites with a reporter or a media outlet? And what is it that reporters really want or are looking for? So let's get right into it. Why not? So it starts with a list. Who are the media people that you need and want to interact with? And that is getting to be a much more complicated list than it ever used to be. So I think kind of expanding your horizons on what it is you want to work on and who you want to talk with is really important. So I kind of look at this as my Santa moment. You need to make a list, check it twice, try to find out who's naughty or nice, and remember that you're Santa. Ask them what they want for Christmas. All right? So let's start with that list. The media organizations in my town include TV, audio, online, but have you thought about including bloggers or YouTubers or influencers in your media list? Print still exists. It's still out there, but it may look different than it did in the past. So if you don't have a way to find out about who are those fringe media people, bloggers, YouTubers, influencers, you might spend a little time Googling that. You might run across somebody who's doing something very interesting in your space. The only cautionary tale that I would tell you about communicating with bloggers, YouTubers, influencers, they may not have the same trained ethics that a journalist has. They just may be in for the splash and the dash and the sensational, and they may not know anything about media ethics when it even comes to sharing things like victims' names or victims' addresses. I would never do that, right? That's my training. But somebody who's a little bit on the fringe may not understand that. You may need to help them with that. The other thing that's also really interesting in this day and age in which we live is that on some level, everybody's a national news source. We can all end up with things going viral, and you just want to be a little bit cognizant of that, I think, when you talk to media. The other really good thing that's happening in the media landscape is just the explosion and growth of what I would call ethnic media or alternate language media, people who are communicating in multiple languages, or to a very small subset of people within your communities that may be very helpful. I often worry that even though I work for a giant news radio station that communicates in English, that sometimes we don't do enough to consider recommending where people can get more information in Spanish, or even working more closely with Spanish language media in a city like Denver, Colorado. I just think you need to take a minute to think about who else needs to hear your message and who that media list might include based on your marketplace. So if you've never given any thought to kind of outside of the traditional media, I hope you think about it. There are a lot of people out there doing some very interesting community-based things. So how do you grow a media relationship? It's really easy to write down a list of all the TV stations in your community, but it's a lot harder to grow a media relationship. And you have to think about what it is you're really looking for from that media relationship and who's on the other side. Sometimes it can just start with you see or hear a reporter you really like and you want to reach out to them because you think they do a great job. It's nothing more complicated than that. Other times it's very strategic. You want to make sure that you are in great communication with the top people at the top media outlets in your city. So I just would say think a little bit about who you want to have a relationship with. So how do you help a media organization create the content that they need, right? Media organizations have fewer people than ever. We need your help in the community space with helping us create content. But the diversity of what we do and how we do it and the time we have to spend on it may be so changed than the media of old. So that means it may be on you to provide photos, audio, video, documentations, graphs, maps, charts, things like that may need to be provided to the media to help them with their own storytelling. The days in which we had entire departments to come up with that are kind of over, right? That doesn't happen anymore. And so that puts a lot more responsibility on your shoulders to help us make a story worthy of the air of the printed product, of the internet. You may need to provide us with these types of ancillary things that help us with storytelling. And I would just tell you to think about that within your own organization. Who's good at taking pictures? Who's good at recording video, even on your phone? That is sometimes the key to making a great video story presentation and something that you might need to share. There are obviously permissions that are involved with sharing photos and video that you have to be willing to say, yes, I will let you use this photo or video in a commercial environment, and I'm not going to charge you for it. The days of media paying for those things are also kind of waning. It still happens in a very rare situation, but often you are expected to provide photos, video, audio, all kinds of ancillary documents for free. It's great to send news releases. I still work in a newsroom that we read every news release that's emailed to us. Email is still the way in which we get a lot of information. But I have a couple of things that are kind of my pet peeves, and I hope you'll take them in the spirit in which I intend them, that I'm really trying to give you the best opportunity to get through all of the hundreds and hundreds of news releases an organization like mine can receive. So if you send out a news release, make sure you have people ready to answer questions and to do on-the-record interviews immediately. Nothing is more frustrating than to get a news release and go, that's interesting, and you call the person or email them back and they tell you that no one will be available to answer your question until next week. I mean, that is just so disappointing as a reporter. You caught my attention, you did everything right to grab my attention, and then when I ask you for follow-up or for an interview and you tell me no one's available, you're kind of dead to me. I hate to say that, but we have very short-term focus, and you don't want to lose someone's attention once you have it in the media. It's really important. So I would even say if the question in your organization is, we want to send out this news release, but no one's available to talk about it until next week, you should wait until next week to send that news release. It'll be okay. It'll be fine. I'm a big believer in not sending things as attachments or trying not to do things that have attachments with them until a reporter asks for them. And the reason for that, really truthfully, is we are all reading everything on our phones. And attachments are very slow to load, hard to open, sometimes difficult to see on a screen as small as my phone. So I would just encourage you not to send attachments with news releases, to put everything in the body of a news release so that I can easily read it on my telephone. And finally, I'm still surprised at the people who use copy in reverse. So in other words, copy that has a black background. Please don't do that, because how does a newsroom work? We're copying and pasting things into all kinds of different types of programs to help us organize information within our newsrooms, and you just can't copy and paste things that are in reverse. And the same thing for graphics that are too rich and too overdeveloped. It's very hard to share them and very hard to paste them into planning calendars. So I know that's a small thing, but I think it's a big thing. You want to make it easy to get my attention. If you're trying to reach out to me, you want to do everything you can to make communicating with me simple. Give me phone numbers and emails of contact people. It's fine to share social media platforms that you share media on, but don't make it too hard, especially in the beginning. You're just really trying to get my attention. I think this is a really important thing that was not talked about a lot in media training. It's really easy to recognize in a relationship when you need someone more than they need you, and vice versa, right? So I think it's really important to recognize when the media needs you. And when, of course, do they need you? When it's an emergency, right? When it's COVID, it's avian flu, it's a food recall, it's West Nile. We need you. We cannot tell those stories without you. We need you. We need the base information that you provide us about a community. We also need you when you're the expert. We're not experts at anything, but we need you for your expertise. Something came across my desk just yesterday about Liam Payne, the One Direction member who died in Argentina. He apparently was found in his system pink cocaine. This was something that I had not seen referred to until yesterday. If you know what pink cocaine is and pink cocaine is in the news, then you should be reaching out to media organizations and saying, hey, because of the death of Liam Payne, I can explain to you what pink cocaine is. And according to an article that I pulled down yesterday, it's a drug that's often combined with meth, cocaine, opioids, and it's really being seen now primarily in the New York nightlife scene, but I had never heard of it until yesterday. And if you can talk to me on deadline about what pink cocaine is and the fears you might have surrounding it, you're gold. I want to talk to you as soon as I possibly can because of your expertise. Another time in which expertise has really come into focus in my newsroom is an example that I hope will resonate with all of you. We all know there's a month for everything. It's Cancer Month, it's Heart Month, it's Sweets Month. You know, there's a month for everything, right? And somebody decided that somewhere along the way. Well, here in Colorado, everyone's really good at making me aware when it's Radon Month in January. But when I get that news release, as someone who's worked in the media for a long time, it kind of seems like last year's news release that's been put a new date on the top of it, and maybe a sentence or two has been rewritten, but it seems like the same information year after year after year. So this year, in my newsroom, we contacted the state health department and their public information people and kind of challenged them and said, you know, we probably don't talk about radon enough. And we know it's Radon Month, but we don't want to do a story about Radon Month. We want to do a story that's very personal to our newsroom about radon. Would it be possible for you to give us 6 radon tests that we can fan out across homeowners in our newsroom, and then we come back and report the results? We did that in our newsroom. Our health department agreed. Of the 6 radon tests that came back to us, 2 of them, including my home, had a slightly elevated risk of radon. And we shared those results on camera and online and on air that first day. And then we came back and brought back a health department expert the next day to talk to us about radon in a very in-depth way, the dangers of it, the prevalence of it. And then on the 3rd day, with the health department's help, we talked to a victim of lung cancer who believes that her lung cancer was caused by radon. It was, you just couldn't turn it off radio. It was so compelling to hear her talk about the good lifestyle she'd led. And because she lived in a home that tested high for radon, she ended up having lung cancer, surviving it, and how she now teaches people about the dangers of radon. Because of our reporting over the course of 3 days, a contractor contacted us and said, I want to tell you about all the things that are happening in the construction industry that we now do to protect people from radon exposure. That was a total win. We got so much feedback. We ended up covering a story over the course of 4 days in our newsroom that is normally like the 2-sentence story that's like, oh, it's National Radon Month. You should do a radon test in your house. It became so much more meaningful and so much more fulfilling and such a good interaction with our state health department. I hope that story and sharing that story just gives you a little bit of an insight about how a media relationship can turn into a better telling of a story. Finally, when does the media need you? On the hardest to fill content days for us. If you have a story that we would refer to as evergreen, that's kind of always out there or seasonally out there, it's really important that you consider making information available to us on days that are weekends, maybe around holidays. The biggest day we fear in my newsroom is the day after a holiday. So a Tuesday after a Monday holiday. Mondays sometimes are very hard content days to fill. So I would just encourage you to think about recognizing when the media needs you and trying to fill that void when you can. We really appreciate it. And that's how good media relationships start, is when we appreciate getting content. So how do you connect? Emails are great. You can address them to the desk at a certain media organization. In larger media organizations, the desk, the assignment desk, is who decides what gets covered that day. But it's really fine to connect with an individual reporter or news manager when you can. Sometimes that goes a long, long way to making sure your story gets published, gets on the air, gets online. Another thing that I think is somewhat successful is just consider a media tour. Pick a day and try to make appointments with all the media that you want to interface with and actually go meet them, shake their hand, make sure they have your content information, have just even a brief 15-minute discussion about this is what we are experts in. So if you ever come across a story that needs this type of expertise, please reach out to us. I think that's really great. I'll be honest though, the days of me having the time to do lunch or coffee or some extended meeting are probably over, but I still don't mind someone who's willing to stop by the newsroom, shake my hand, meet a reporter, an anchor, see how we work. I'm really grateful for that. I think that's really great. Social media, a lot of us just meet each other virtually. It's really okay to follow a media organization or a reporter on social, and generally they should follow you back. That just gives you another shot at them seeing information that you might be interested in. Another thing that I think about connecting with the media, and this may involve a larger footprint of people within your organization, is if you were to write a novel, who in your organization is a great character? I think we all know people in our organization that are characters right out of a book or a short story. And should they be your storyteller because of just how creative and sparky and different and interesting they might be? And they might be interesting for a whole bunch of different reasons. But I just want you to consider that sometimes the greatest stories are told by someone who can sit on the porch and tell a story. So media people like that. Another thing that's really helpful for me if you do interface with the media is just make it very clear with a local media organization how you will communicate in a crisis situation. Do you use X, Facebook, or Instagram? I'm not a big believer in TikTok as an official way to communicate, but if you are, tell us that. X is very helpful in a lot of crisis information places, at least that I deal with. You can communicate a lot of short information very quickly, and we all see it. Facebook is used by a lot of organizations here in Colorado that don't have like an official public information officer, and they know that by using Facebook, they can communicate with their communities and with the media kind of simultaneously. And if that's what you do, that's fine. Just make it clear to us that that's what you do, if you can. Let's talk a little bit, though, about making sure you have a diverse group of media people that you reach out to and communicate with. And the hurricanes that just happened in North Carolina is a great example of that. The devastation was unbelievable. Many media outlets were unable to work because of power loss, because of just people loss. They couldn't get people into their organizations. So I hate to brag about my particular company, but this is a good reason to brag. In the case of the hurricane in Asheville, North Carolina, our radio stations, some of which were knocked off the air, but our radio stations decided to consolidate emergency information, consolidated the staff, and remained on the air for hours sharing critical information. And it was just a win all the way around. People could call in on whatever cell phone battery they had left, get information, share information. And so while radio may not always be the top of your mind when it comes to emergency and disaster information, that was a case where radio really was a superstar in the first days after the hurricane. There are other times when we all know that it's all about TV, right? And you need to be able to figure out how to share information with a television station that likely includes video to be able to help them in a crisis. We all like knowing what you're going to do and a predictability about it. I would say the people in Asheville, North Carolina did a great job at saying, we are going to hold daily media briefings at 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. And they stuck with that schedule for about 10 days. And it was super helpful for all of us in and out of the media to have a predictable place to know where you were going to answer questions and to share information. I just think the more you can do to make it simple for the media in a crisis environment, the better off you are. It works out great. So how does the media communicate with you? Do you really want media people communicating with you? I hope so. Emails and phone calls are probably still the preferred method for most media people to communicate with you, but does that work for your organization? My organization has really eliminated the day of a receptionist. It's sometimes hard to get through to us on the phone. We don't mean for it to be, but it is harder than it ever has been. And so you need to just think about, you know what, I used to call her all the time, but I'm going to email her. I know I'll get her attention with an email. Generally, media people do want to talk to a public information officer, someone who has been trained and has the time and the bandwidth to deal with us. But if you don't have someone dedicated to that role, who acts in that role, and do you have backups in that role? Generally, a crisis happens when you're away from the office. We all know that. And that you just need to have kind of a chain of command set up for public information as well as other types of crisis situations that you plan for. I'm such a fan of the way the Forest Service does incident command. Next one up. Who is trained to be the next one up to fill that job? And sometimes, like we saw in the hurricane in North Carolina, you have to have the next person up trained and ready to go so that you can sleep. It was a 24/7 emergency, and people needed to be trained to do shift work for media coverage as well. And maybe you don't really think about that, but that's why it's important to have depth. And then I would just think, are you checking your social media to make sure media people are following you on social? You might just want to nudge them to do that, especially if you do use social media well. To communicate stories and needed information for your community. Is the information about your organization easily found? In other words, Google yourself. Can I find your media contact quickly if I Google the name of your organization plus media contact? You just might want to think about how you're presenting yourself online to be able to be found by reporters. I would also say I've gotten a little bit of feedback like this. Like, I work in a newsroom where we type in capital letters all day, every day. So if I don't think about that and I send you an email in shouty caps, are you offended by that? Don't be. Please don't be. Recognize that I'm typing in capital letters all day, every day, because I'm not trying to punctuate for sentence case or for print publication. Um, if I say, do you have somebody who can talk to me in 15 minutes? Does that offend you? That's just the nature of 24/7 news coverage and the deadline I might be facing. Try very hard not to be offended by that, but try to respond with an honest answer. I don't have someone in 15 minutes, but I do have someone available in 30. I'll always make it work, but I will always ask for more than you could probably possibly deliver. Um, I think this is something that we also don't talk about a lot, but in television, if you are dealing in a television market that is not New York or Chicago or LA, you are probably talking to a member of the media that has lived in your community less than 2 years. They may not have any memory of your last disaster. They may not have any memory of how well you did on camera a year and a half ago during a big media presentation. It may be discouraging for you as an invested member of a community organization to know that your media person doesn't know you or doesn't know anything about your community, and the turnover in media is high. A lot of people work on 2-year contracts, so to me it feels a little bit like the military, like you're always having to retrain a media person because they come and go so quickly. So I hope you're not discouraged by that. I hope you're encouraged by that to keep media contacts fresh. It's really important. And the other thing that I think is also shocking when you're on the other end of a media interview is how fast we can sometimes work. That you're scheduled for a media interview and it might last 10 minutes. We may not have any more time than that to gather raw information. We do not have an hour to give to you. I'm so grateful that you're so generous with your time in this webinar, but for the most part, media interviews are very, very short, 10 minutes or less. I do some interviews that are 5 minutes or less, and I expect people to speak in sound bites, and that may be so discouraging to you. But I hope you're not offended by that. It's just the pace at which we work and the number of stories that we may do in a day are very complex, and the number is just so great. So don't be concerned if you're asked to do a 10-minute interview. You're still very important to us. We just may not have more time than that. So some tips for you and takeaways, and I hope we have questions, but there's just some things I think is really important for us to talk about in disasters. Media will follow your lead in a disaster, but you have to lead. You have to be strong and strident and say, we will give you updates on this schedule. We will not do interviews outside of that. And if you tell us that, you better hold to that. If we find out in a disaster you gave your favorite reporter an extra interview, we're going to be a little miffed. We're going to be a little mad. Outside of a disaster, if you give your favorite reporter an interview, we're going to work even harder to be your favorite reporter. You really need to simplify in a disaster how you're going to communicate and consistently communicate that dated information. I really do like about it. I will go back to firefighting examples. A lot of forest fires that I cover, they will communicate an evening update to us and clearly say, this is the last update we will do tonight. We do not anticipate sharing any other information tonight. And so we kind of know we can go to bed too. We know that you are not going to give us updated information at midnight. If you think you're going to give us updated information at midnight, we'll stay up and we'll stay with you if it's that kind of a crisis. But if you're telling us at 9 p.m., this is the last update of the evening, we'll believe you and we'll go home and go to bed too. I really encourage people to think creatively about how to work with an individual reporter to tell a story. You might be really surprised, just like my radon example, like what an individual reporter might be willing to do to tell a story that's unique to them, a story that they feel like they can tell well. I just don't bring the creative. We love the science, we love the math, we love the graphs and charts, but don't be afraid to be creative about how you might think about storytelling with a reporter. And here's another thing that I think has really changed over the course of my career that we need to talk about. I almost refuse to talk to anyone off the record. We all live in a 24/7 news environment. If you're going to tell me something off the record, it, it's probably something you shouldn't be telling me. I'm just going to be honest. I think on background is different. It's like if you can tell me in the middle of the COVID crisis on background, starting next week, we're going to start testing wastewater, and we want to tell you about that, but we want you to understand a little bit about how wastewater testing works so you feel comfortable going on the air talking about wastewater. I think that's different. Schooling me a little bit ahead of an announcement might be helpful, but anytime you tell a reporter anything, you have to be understanding that it may be reported. So even if you say on background, we want to talk to you about how we're going to start testing wastewater, don't be surprised if a reporter goes on the air 2 hours later and say, this just in, our county's going to start testing wastewater. And so that's why I just think those are very slippery, scary slopes that you're so much better off just being willing to communicate on the record, on deadline. Today, we all live in today, this hour, this moment. I just think off the record, it just doesn't happen anymore. And I kind of feel the same way about embargoed information. If you're going to say something, be ready to say it now. I just don't find a lot of benefit from embargoed information. You may have had a different, much more positive experience in your community, but in my world, in a 24/7 news environment, if you're ready to tell me, I will be ready to share it immediately. So those are just some things based on my experiences. And then I just kind of have some final tips before we take some questions. All of us are generally working with news media partners. I have a television partner here in Denver that we share information with. I obviously am a part of a larger company that has a nationwide footprint. If you tell me something's happening in Denver and in Oklahoma City, I'm going to talk to you, and then I'm immediately going to share that information with Oklahoma City. We've got a radio station there. I can hit a button on my desktop and share that information with Oklahoma City. So you might want to think just a little bit about how information gets shared both locally and nationally when you, or even regionally, when you do an interview with someone. A lot of television stations, this is their new stock and trade, that they do an interview in Poughkeepsie, and then suddenly your soundbite is being shared all up and down the eastern seaboard. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. I just think it's important for you to be somewhat aware of where news media shares information and how consolidated our companies have become. But in the same token, we can share information very, very quickly across a national footprint when it's important for us to do so. So those are just some things that I think are important to consider about how the news media is changing and evolving, and yet how your input into it is very, very important and very much appreciated. Christy, do we have questions?
Kathy, we do. You are amazing as always. So our first question is, any special considerations to grow a media relationship when you're in a rural region and the news outlets are tens or 100 miles away?
I think that's really critical because the reality is very much that depending upon the situation, a news outlet 100 miles away may need to know what you're sharing. So even knowing their emails, like their desk emails when you have an important piece of information to share is super important. But that also makes me think about you have to be the media when you're in the very rural situation, and you have to have a place where you share things externally that may be picked up by the media, but maybe only picked up by your particular community. And whether you like it or not, I think Facebook is still that place. I think if you're sharing news information directly from an official account on Facebook, it works pretty well to be able to share it both locally and regionally.
We have been speaking a lot about contacting your media. What would be our viewers' first and easiest way to even find out where those emails are? Is it to visit each one of their websites and look up the reporters, or how do they even find the media in their area?
I think that's a really good question and a harder one. And just like I was saying, you might call here and you may never get to me. I answer the phone in our newsroom, but just it's getting more complicated. Yes, I think start with our websites, be willing to send a random email, be willing to make a random phone call in addition to that. And I do respond really well if people just call the newsroom and say, hey, we're looking to make sure that we have your wide distribution newsroom email list in case we have a story to pitch to you or in case of an emergency. And again, if you'd have called me yesterday and said, I'm an expert on opioids, I would have said, can you do an interview right now about pink cocaine? So anytime you reach out to a media source, you have to be on your toes that maybe they have a story that's running right in front of them that they want to talk to you immediately, and that whoever's doing that phone call should be willing to manage that information up. But yeah, I still think calling and emailing is the way to do it.
When I was still working terrorism after 9/11 and going through training, the Department of Homeland Security PIO would always say, over body bags is not the time to exchange business cards. And that's stuck in my brain, and I remember that since that day. So again, finding the people who are out there ahead of time. This other question just came in that said, are reporters specialized anymore? Back in our day when we started, you had a beat. Is that the case still now with our 24/7 news cycle, or is that gone
Wow.
by the wayside?
It's getting more and more rare. Here in Denver, there are small groups of reporters that are still organized as investigative reporters, a couple that might work on an education beat, but I would say for the most part, specialized reporters have just kind of disintegrated. It doesn't happen often that you will come across a specialized reporter. If you do, work really hard to get to know them. But I would say you have to be accepting that most reporters do not have any special expertise in your area, and you need to be a little bit teacher, trainer, coach, and expert.
That was my next question. Do you think that's part due to the 2-year contract and the reporters moving around as easily as they do now? Nobody stays for 20 years at a newsroom anymore.
Agreed, Christy. It's a sad part of the reality of the media. There are still plenty of people working in information dissemination, but the reality of it is traditional media is somewhat shrinking in terms of people. Part of it's the technology. We can do so much more so quickly than we used to be able to accomplish. We can shoot stories on our phones. I can do radio interviews on my phone, that we don't need as much equipment or technology in order to do a story. And so, yes, that has caused there to be just a collapse of the number of people working in a news environment. And because of that turnover, that churn, you have to be willing to deal with maybe the sharpest person you've ever met, or somebody who needs a lot of background information coaching to understand the story you're talking about. It's sad, but it's real.
Our next question, this is a good one. It was submitted. Can you give suggestions of what to do if the medical officer wants to do all the media, but the person with the most knowledge works in public health?
That's a hard one because that's politics, right? That's politics. That's internal politics within your organization. And that's where sometimes someone with a really big title views it as an important way of managing up to be the person quoted or on camera or on the air in a media environment. I would say this. If you can convince that person to letting more than one person speak on a story, you might really be able to evaluate the metrics of how that story was shared and communicated and whose soundbite was picked over the other. I've dealt with a couple of people in those roles that it's no fault of their own, but they either don't have a great on-camera presence or they don't have a good voice. They're not a great verbal communicator. They might be excellent in a print environment, and you might want to try and steer them to those types of things that they really excel at, but not everyone has the voice for radio. Not everyone has the face for television. I don't have a face for television. I would always pick someone else in my organization to do an on-camera interview, but I might always be willing to do a print interview or a radio interview. So I think the challenge of that is you either have to be willing to spend a lot of time with your chief medical officer training them to be a better interview, or you have to say, we can get so much further faster. And the goal is information further faster if you let me do these types of interviews and we save these types of interviews for you. I think there's a way to share the wealth, but I am totally understanding of the politics. We certainly deal with people every day that like to make themselves available to the media because they're politicking for their next job. We get it. We understand. And I'm so sorry.
That leads me right into my next question of how do you handle mis or disinformation? Our first webinar in this 4-part series was from Dr. David Dijak, our CEO, and he was talking about the difference of those. Some can be malicious, some cannot. On both sides of this situation, what happens when you receive misinformation or old information that hasn't been updated? How do you handle that on both sides when you get bad information or you've reported on bad information?
I'm going to try to answer this question clearly, but I'm also going to try not to say anything that anyone would view as being inappropriate. So we recently covered a media event in which the speaker told an untruth, told a lie, blamed something that had happened on someone who had no responsibility for it. I made it clear in my newsroom that we were not going to repeat that soundbite, that just because that person said it out loud, it didn't make it true, right? So on some level, that's how I handle disinformation, is that I have the ability to look things up and to remember and have time on the planet that makes me go, that's not how that story went. This person is telling it in their own way and it's not true. So the easiest answer is I usually will only choose sound bites from any expert that can explain their direct expertise about a situation. In other words, it's almost like a lawyer deciding hearsay. I do not use sound bites from someone who cannot speak to that because they were either A, not directly involved, or that's not their area of expertise. So I try really hard to almost use that courtroom kind of example, that I don't let hearsay become part of this soundbite. The disinformation part of it is hard. I got pretty riled up in my newsroom over getting a news release from a state agency that I didn't analyze the information they were telling me well enough. They left something out, and I should have recognized that they were intentionally leaving something out of a news release that they shared with us. And it wasn't until more than a week and a half later that they said, oh, by the way, there is more to this story, and filled out the information about a week and a half later. I was very angry at myself for not recognizing that they had clearly left a big hole in their story, and I should have asked about it immediately. So I guess misinformation or lack of information still happens, but I would hope that actual lies don't happen. And
Yeah,
I try to make sure that the person who's speaking in a soundbite has the knowledge to speak to that. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, that's a very good point of not only what is in the soundbite or press release, but what is not.
Yep. And I was pretty upset that I didn't read between the lines. And there were clearly lines to be read between. And so I would just say, I think a better tactic is, we expect to have an update on this story in about a week. We expect to have more to share with you. More information is still coming in, and we will share that with you in about a week. At least it gives me the opportunity to follow up and call you back next week and go, did anything more come of that? You kind of indicated that there might be more to tell. Did that happen?
Talk a little bit about, say, your local environmental health professional is doing an interview and they are asked a question they're uncomfortable with. Is it okay for them to say, I don't know the answer, but I know who does, or I will look into that, or I will get you in touch with the person who can clarify that for you? I know some of our membership have that hesitation to go in front of the media just in that case.
I think that's totally acceptable. It's totally fine. Absolutely, positively. Obviously, it's a little harder to do that in a live interview, but it's not impossible. I think anytime you're in a taped interview or a interview that's for print, it's absolutely 100% okay to say, I don't have that information, but I will get someone to you who does have that information. Or that's really not the information that my agency collects or gathers or can speak to. What we can speak to, it's always to me important to come back with what you can speak to. This is what I can tell you today. I think that's always helpful. In a live interview, I think it is something that you might want to practice. If you get asked a question you cannot answer, some people's tactic is just to go back to their talking points, and I find that a little disingenuous. On the other hand, I think it's okay to say, I'll need to get back to you on that. Next question. I think that's okay.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for just a couple more questions. What kind of stories in environmental and public health would the press most be interested in? Is it just the crisis, this is happening now, or can it be used as an educational tool such as the radon story?
I like doing trend stories. And this is where your longevity in a job might really be super interesting to me. Like, in other words, if you can see the trend of where we never used to talk about gonorrhea or syphilis, and now we're talking about it all the time, I find that super interesting. Certainly, we've even seen, because of vaccinations or lack thereof, certain health issues kind of bubbling back up to the top. If you see a trend in any way, shape, or form over the course of your career, or even the last 5 years, the last 2 years, I love doing trend stories. Um, I think they're very interesting. And so that's where sometimes you might come to me with, you know what, we didn't expect to find this, but we just compiled all our data and we're really pretty surprised at this. We thought you might be surprised too. I love trend stories. So I don't think that's ever a bad pitch to a media person. Is a trend, an emerging trend, or like the end of a trend. It used to be a thing where we told you never to drink bottled water. Well, guess what? The bottles are better. Go ahead, drink bottled water. I think that's okay.
Now you hit on a word that we have to deal with all the time, data. How do you present data in an interesting way for a media story? You never want to just get up there and start rattling numbers and figures. How do you present data interesting to the media and the story?
Uh, I think how you frame the data is really important, and it's almost like walking down the grocery store aisle. Does it say new, improved, better formula? I think there's a little bit of that works. I also think it gets back to that, who should be the storyteller. There are some people who can tell data stories and use analogies that are so meaningful and resonant. There are other people who sound like your mathematics instructor. Try not to pick the math instructor. And my brother's a math instructor, but try not to pick him.
And also the use of acronyms. We hear that all the time. Don't do those in a news story. Nobody's going to know what you're referring to. So we have a few minutes left. So Candy, any last minute quick do's, don'ts you want to share?
I
Just to
think
make
it's
you feel more comfortable to approach the media and make that phone call to a reporter.
I think it's really easy to think about how you can be helpful. And I think most people have that desire. You wouldn't be in the jobs you're in unless you're trying to be helpful. And I think the best reporters and the best, relationships with reporters really come out of that. How can I help you? I have something interesting to share. I have something interesting to share that might be good for you on a really slow day. Even like the election day itself, you want to be able to tell a story earlier in the day that doesn't have anything to do with the elections. And so it's even trying to think a little bit about when and how you can be helpful. And so even coming into the holidays, there's a lot of need for stories that just aren't organically happening because so many people take vacations, but we still have the same amount of room to fill with stories. So I just think start with, how can I be helpful? That's a really good place to start.
You can talk about the temperature of your turkey and make
Yes,
sure that your Thanksgiving and Christmas meals are safe.
food safety around this time of year is a really big deal. I think it's really important. I think all those kinds of things are great. And if you can do an interview wearing a Santa hat or, your turkey lapel pin, go for it. I think that helps.
Kathy, it is always such a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your amazing experience and career with us. I would ask everyone to please take a few moments and fill out the short survey that you will receive, because your feedback is instrumental in allowing us to bring you the topics that are relevant and needed for your career and to complete our mission to build, sustain, and empower and effective environmental workforce. Again, Kathy, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.